welcome back to the channel. Thank you for continuing to support the channel, and for those that are new to this environment, let's say, thank you for tuning in. It's a pleasure to be talking to you, and do consider subscribing and liking this video and sharing it with your friends and family who you think this could be beneficial to. Also, watch other videos. I'll recommend videos from time to time in this disquisition that may help you understand stuff that I'm talking about here. So today, I want to do something I've done a couple of times, but this time I want to stay closer to the material at hand, let's say. So I want to stay closer to, let's say, a close reading of Jung and his own ideas, while in other videos I tend to diverge a little bit and put things in my own terms and my own sort of little universe that I've built in terms of terminology and combining Jungian thought with other trajectories of thought, especially from narrative psychology. But today I want to stay sort of in the close loop to Jung and attempt to relate, especially my theory of the ego and its structure, so the sort of narrative structure of the ego constructed from elements that are situated within it, relate that to the sort of Jungian understanding of, and the Jungian terminology, where you have complexes, you have a structure of the psyche that's built upon, an ego-self relationship, you have archetypes that are sort of on the fundament of that, and you have especially, this is important also, you have an archetypal field, you have a self field, and whatever that means, and how that relates to sort of the expression of the ego. So this is going to be a more theoretical video, and I hope you all can follow. If you're having problems following, please do comment in the comment section below this video, and I can respond or make other videos and clarify certain points, and also consider watching other videos like the videos I did on the narrative body. I think that helps understanding the kind of stuff that is going on here in Jung. So okay, let's jump right into it. So you have the general distinction in Jung that is shared with, let's say someone like Freud, where you have the sort of the ego at the center of personality, a center of consciousness, let's say, that expresses to the outside world who you are. And Jung goes on to calling that the persona at some point. But at first you have the ego, and Jung writes, we understand the ego as the complex factor to which all conscious contents are related. It forms, as it were, the center of the field of consciousness, and insofar as this comprises the empirical personality, the ego is the subject of all personal acts of consciousness. The relation of the psychic content to the ego forms the criterion of its consciousness, for no content can be conscious unless it is represented to a subject. So what does this mean? Let's sort of disentangle it. Yeah. So first, the ego is a complex factor to which all conscious contents are related. Okay, so you have two elements here that need to be clarified. You have the element, the complex factor, and you have the element of conscious contents and the element of relationality. Okay, so I think it's easiest to start off with an understanding of complexes. So what for Jung are complexes, and how do they play out, and what sort of is a complex, okay? So for Jung had his association experiments. So the experiments essentially that made him, in the first half of his life, that made him sort of, not, let's say famous, or that he contributed to Freudian theory. And that is that he essentially had, in his active imagination, this factor is the fundament of his active imagination. So the experiments were set up like this, something like that. You had a list of words, and Jung would read out the list of words to the patient, and the patient would be hooked up to a device, and that was a sort of a Galvanian measurement device, so measurement of skin conductance, I guess, that is also used in lie detectors today. And Jung would read out a word, and the person would respond with the first word that came to their minds. And so it'll go like bear, and they go like forest, and whatever. And they'd say, and so there are two things that are important. And of course, it's also interesting from a Lacanian perspective, if you think about it, the unconscious structure like language. But I don't want to go into that also because I don't know much about it, but feel free to share what you know. But the point is here that you essentially have a word that's associated with another word. And sometimes the reaction on the skin conductance is neutral, so it's just normal, it's baseline. And sometimes there's a change. And whenever there's a change, Jung posited that he essentially found something like a cluster of words that he then referred to as a complex. So as he would initially call it, find that. Anyways, there was an initial name, another name he had for it. It was something like 3 words. I'm forgetting it, but essentially, the point is that the point of a complex is that you have a cluster, a network of associations, images or ideas, memories, and the like, clustered around a nucleus, and they're held together by a common emotional tone. And this is precisely when I refer to in other videos, when I refer to elements or sort of elements within the conscious mind, within the unconscious. Then this is precisely what I mean, right? It's something that has been instantiated in, and what I'll say, I'm just being careful not to say things that you probably won't, you may not know what they mean, but something has been instantiated in the linearity of the ego that has been developed previously. So you have sort of your ego as the center of the field of consciousness, expresses as sort of the linearity, at least to the outside, and which enables you to function in daily life, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to function. If you wouldn't pretend to be coherent, you wouldn't be able to function. So you have to pretend to be coherent, just like you have to pretend that your body is a unit, a whole unit that sort of works when you move through the world. Okay, so so in order to do that, and this is the second part of the sentence, right? These complexes have to be related to the central complex, which is the ego, and I'll get to that in a second, in all instances. And so this relationship is interesting, and here's, I think, where narrative understandings come in, because what happened, like what's going on here, right? You have these something happens to you, like, and usually if the complexes become problematic in your own life, it's usually a traumatic experience or a traumatic issue that's at stake. But what happens here is essentially that something foreign, something unknown is encountered, let's say, right? And it's somehow foreign, therefore it's unknown. And what you essentially end up doing is applying something that you already know to this occurrence, right? So this is pretty evident also from neuroscience, where you have sort of where you integrate bottom up to understand certain occurrences. So it's not like you have an occurrence like you see a swing. I'm looking at a swing right now in the garden. So you have a swing, and it's like, oh, you have the sort of the grandmother cell, it's called, and you have a cell that fires, and it goes like swing, woo, cool. No, it's not like that. It's more like you have the individual components of the swing, from starting with lines and edges and shadows and light differences, and they all integrate. So that's how it starts in your visual cortex, right? The low resolution integration. And already at that stage, the specific combination, so the pattern of firing based on which integrate, so higher cognitive cells can integrate sort of which lower resolution or lower cells, let's say, without evoking a low-high metaphor or whatever, but cells that are earlier in the integration hierarchy, those higher cells can integrate which cells are firing and what their weights are, essentially. So it's like, okay, what's very important about this object? What's sort of salient? And it'll be something like an edge, and that, when that's particularly related to another edge, and And so it's just the intensity and the weights between these units that are firing on a cellular level are compared to previously experienced firing patterns of networks, right? Let's say. And so based on that, you already come up with a hypothesis, I think, essentially about what this may be. And that's integrated further and then compared again to sort of to sort of your memory systems and then integrated into an object that you imagine, but it's not and then into a word. And I think that's precisely what's happening when you're encountering, you think on this so in psychodynamic terms, you think about what's going on in the, when you encounter unknown territory or novelty, it's precisely what's going on, right? You relate it to something new, and you relate something new to something known, and thereby you come up with a hypothesis what this object may be and what its place, and again here, in relationship to the ego may be. And so what is the ego, right? It's simply, it has to be, I think, it has to be seen as an interpretive, I always say an interpretive gaze, so like it's the central interpretive axiom of the psyche. Like it's essentially dictating how everything in your psyche hangs, not psyche is a bad word, but how everything within the psyche, let's say, hangs together. Like how all the complexes that are sort of independent and remain to be independent hang together for the sake of linearity. And so you may say that the ego's purpose is to create linearity. And therefore it has certain hypotheses, it has certain axioms, but in itself, it's not really laden with content, in as much as that content is sort of let's say decentralized and distributed over the sort of, evoke a spatial metaphor, over the space of the network that constitutes the ego as a whole, right? But it's not, the ego doesn't own these complexes, they're independent. And this is quite central to Jung. So he writes, for example, everyone knows nowadays that people have complexes. What is not so well known, though far more important theoretically, is that complexes can have us. And I think this is quite central, because you have, the standard example, someone is a very decent person during the day, they're teaching or they're working their job, they love all their colleagues, they make coffee for their like whatever colleagues, whoever, feed the dog and everything, pet cats on the street, and then they go home and like beat up their children and their wife and I don't know, go murder their neighbor or something like that, and what happens here is that complexes have people, right? Something came up that was, you would say, suppressed, but it's I think this may be sort of what would be going on in a Freudian sense, but I think in Jungian terms, it's more like it can be expressed better in saying that, it's just the ego ensured that you can function normally during the day because of a certain constellation. And for Jung, this is sort of the notion of constellation is key, because it's basically it basically explains to you why certain actions happen. So it's like, for him, constellation is the reason why an archetype later, we'll get to that later, gets activated, but it's also for him, again, as we say here, this could involve sort of a place, but it most importantly involves different aspects of complexes that are activated. And so now we get into another interesting thing about complexes that we'll discuss in a second. So we squared away this first part. So we understand the ego as the complex factor to which all conscious contents are related. It forms, as it were, the center of the field of consciousness. So you have the ego in the center of consciousness, right? This is quite self-evident. And insofar as this comprises the empirical personality, the ego is the subject of all personal acts of consciousness. So the ego, right, it is essentially when you behave, right, as this relationality, in this relationality theory. So you have the ego here, somehow the centralized narrative. I call it the central, the central complex, let's say, right? You have the central interpretive complex, and that interprets all these other elements, right, or complexes that are all comprised of different sort of aspects, but retain their autonomy. So Jung also says that these complexes, in his book on the dynamic of the psyche, he also assesses that these complexes can be intergenerational, and sort of like ghosts, which I think is quite striking. But most importantly, for the moment, these complexes are units that are sort of installed by others and continue to unfold and develop. They because, and this is key, right, to also everything I say. I always say there's a sort of the logic of debt operating here, right, where you have you borrow these complexes from others, and these other people again borrow them from others, and so on. It's an infinite. It's like money, right? It's an infinite cycle of debt. Like there's no one actually owns these complexes. No one actually owns the sort of the image of like what is a good physician, right? No one owns that image, but everyone sort of has this we would say colloquially, right? We would say presupposition, or you could say something like a stereotype, but it's not that. It's not that. It's well, stereotypes may form in the context of that. I don't know. I haven't really thought about that intensively, but it's like you think that being a good person involves something like reading, right? Reading books, and so that this has been installed into your linearity, let's say, by someone, and this someone owns this complex with relation to you, right? They own the contents of that, and it's usually multiple people, like, because again, what happens is, right, whenever you experience something new, this new is related to this cluster that exists elsewhere, to this complex, right? It's sort of attached to it like a sticky pin or whatever, and like a magnet, more like metal to a magnet. You have a complex, it's in the magnet, and so everything clusters around that. And therefore, it's not a single person that can bring this this complex into constellation again. It may be though, because and this is again going back to constellations, right? You have this moment where you suddenly feel this striking, this crying. Like yesterday, I read in a book, for example, that it's about this fictional character, and she was an art student, and she was sort of, the book was about like how rough the art world is, and how it's sort of concerned with, having to fake emotions and fake love and all that stuff and blah blah blah. And she was with this new, she was in her exhibition that was just being launched, and someone made some mistake, and it was because she didn't really check on the other person, and then this other guy that she had a love affair with would point out, oh, I really like what this woman did, and this other person that the main protagonist didn't control, and the protagonist started to cry, but didn't cry, like she repressed it and ran to the bathroom. But it was like, and it's autobiographical, so it's the actual story of the author. But she and so the point was that this other person triggered something that he installed in there in the linearity, because he also sponsored the entire exhibition and owned the exhibition hall and everything. And so it was sort of like there was something that was triggered, and the constellation occurred because he was in that moment, he was there, he activated it, right? And so the relation of the psychic content to the ego forms the criterion of its consciousness. So if something is conscious, it has to be related to for something to be conscious, it has to be related to the ego. Okay. And the ego rests, and this is another quote from Ion, following page, subsequent page. Ion is one of Jung's books, and so the subsequent page, Jung continues to say, well, on the other hand, the ego rests on the total field of consciousness, and on the one hand, the ego rests on the total field of consciousness, so those are the complexes. On the other hand, on the sum of total of unconscious contents. These fall into three groups. So you have the temporarily subliminal contents that can be reproduced voluntarily, so memory. So this would still be part, I think, and how I read Jung, this would still be part of consciousness. Second, unconscious contents that cannot, so this is something like, I forgot where my key is and I find it again. Second, unconscious contents that cannot be reproduced voluntarily. So this is something you would work out in typical, let's say, Freudian therapy, right? It's like, you can't reproduce something, there's a trauma, let's work it out, right? Someone else can help you. Or it could also just be something simple like, I forgot this person's name that we met at the dinner last night, and that I can ask my wife, and she can be like, oh, it was actually person XYZ. And third, contents that are not capable of becoming conscious at all. Group 3 is hypothetical, right? So it's hypothetical because it is a logical inference from things that are happening in group 1 or 2, right? And this is essentially where you have, I think Freudian analysis would penetrate into this as well, in part, where it's like it's trying to revive stuff that you can tap into, but then again, you can't really tap into something you can tap into, right? So I think Jung here implies also the collective unconscious. Something that cannot be made conscious, like something you cannot recall. It's impossible, but you can recall its effects on you. And so to continue here. You have the ego as the relation, the last sentence from this ego quote, so that's I on page 3. The relation of a psychic content to the ego forms the criterion of its consciousness, for no content can be conscious unless it is represented to a subject. So so we also see that the ego fundamentally is representational, right? It's always representing itself to itself and to others, okay? So I want to reread you a quote from Shalit, his book, The Complex Path of Transformation from Archetype to Ego. And so he writes here, complex denotes a network of associations, images, ideas, memories, or the like, clustered around a nuclear archetypal core of meaning and characterized and held together by a common emotional tone. Thus, the complex embodies 3 elements: an archetypal core around which personal experience cluster, and an emotional tone that serves as the gravitational force that holds this microcosm together. Okay, so taking this apart, you have essentially the hypothesis of the archetype ingrained in the idea of the complex. And this is actually I think this is the most interesting thing about Jung, that you have these layers, so the unconscious, consciousness, and the collective unconscious, so the archetype, you have them entangled. And so we can't really, that's why I was also struggling to say, oh yeah, this is what Freud did, and this is the collective, this is the personal unconscious. It's like, they're so entangled in the Jungian paradigm that you can't really tell them apart. So you have, if you look at the complex as sort of the central problem that we're facing here, you have the complex, yes, but you have to somehow decide, or not you, but it has to be decided where and how they cluster. And here, the archetypal field and actually therefore the self field come into play, right? And this is actually from this from Neumann's text, The Place of Creation, which is a great essay. It's a really good essay to read also as an introduction. It's a bit complex, but it's good. So yeah, I was just finding what I wanted to say. So, well, I know what I want to say, but I was trying to find the correct quote. So the point here is that you have the problem. The question is, how does the self now, or the archetype as sort of a grand structure within the collective unconscious, and the self as the personalized expression of that, how does that influence this process of ego construction and of complex relation to the ego and sort of the issue of complexes having humans, right? So this is, I think, this is for having people. So this is, I think, what's important and what should concern us. And vis-a-vis, right, the issue of foreshadowing, which must be present in the self if it's to contain all the information about the subject and its destiny, right? So that's the sort of the standard Jungian sort of point is that, oh yeah, well, it's sort of a very deterministic framework where you have the collective unconscious from which the self is a subset, so it's the personalized subset. That's why it lays on the sort of borderline between the collective and the personal unconscious, and then it's connected to the self via the self-ego axis, right? And the question becomes, okay, so how does this work practically, right? So Jung writes, over the whole procedure, there seems to reign a dim foreknowledge, not only of the pattern, but of its meaning. This is in relation to the process of individuation. Jung also speaks and this is Neumann now writing, and Jung also speaks of the archetype, which determines the course of formation, and then quote from Jung, with seeming foreknowledge, or as though it were already in possession of the goal to be circumscribed by the centering process. So the centering process is essentially the process of I'm missing the word. I know where to find it at least, you know. Centroversion. Centroversion, which is the process of the ego being pulled towards the self, right? So this is Neumann's book, History and the Origin of Consciousness. And so what the idea here is that you have the complex, and the complexes are organized along the trajectories of the archetype, right? And then they relate in some sense to the central, so to the ego, to the central interpretive sort of determinant, central conscious determinant. Determinant in the sense that it determines the meaning of its elements, right? And therefore the archetypes sort of they determine the clusters of the ego elements, but they don't determine their meaning and the contents. That wouldn't work, right? You can't say, oh, I already know what you're going to be. You know, I know you're going to be a lawyer. I know you're going to be a whatever, something, teacher. It doesn't, but that's not the case, right? That's never the case with the archetype, that they know anything specific or explicit, and neither does the self. So you have the sort of the archetypal field. Neumann calls it a field, and you have the self field, and you have this sort of, this is my notes now on it, but you have this. Oh, you can see this well. So you have this. You have three explications of sort of the same relationship. So you have the ego in the core. You have the self. So you have the ego up here. You have the self down here. You have a self field, an archetype field. You have the external and the internal world, and so this is the, I don't even know what that circle is supposed to denote. And you have the ego moving to the external, internal world, so to the world and psyche. And so you have that developing, right? This is the sort of the default, right? When you didn't individuate. And this is sort of the situation when you were hit or ruptured, let's say, with the numinous experience, where the archetypal field sort of, or the psyche slips down into the archetypal field, and then you have this moment where this is basically the consolation. Sorry, yeah, this one. This is the situation of individuation, where you have sort of the ego and the self connected, moving downward into the self field, into the archetypal field. It's moved in the archetypal field, it's moving downward into the self field, and then So this is emulating out into this interconnectedness of internal and external. I'm sorry, this was really awkward showing this in the camera. I hope that I can I'll post a link to this graphic if you want. You can find the paper. It's called The Place of Creation by Erich Neumann. You can find it. I think it's down for free. You can download it for free. It's or maybe not. Well, anyways, you can access it via the Cambridge University library, and it's very good. It's a very good paper. And essentially, but what's going on here is that the fact that in the original state, right, in the normal situation, we have the split between the world and the psyche, and the world. The psyche is moving toward the ego, is navigating between this internal and external experience, and you also have a split connection between the ego and the self. It's a theoretical. The axis is there in theory, but there's no sort of the ego is still grappling or dealing with the problem of the complexes and their upheaval, let's say, or their possible upheaval. So it's dealing with the attempt to silence them in order to protect itself in a way, right? And so then, because essentially the self field is the individualized expression of the archetypal field, so it's more concrete, right? It's the God of the individual. It's the objective center of the psyche, and so we have no real connection to that in the normal constellation. And when essentially, as soon as a sort of a moment of numinous overwhelming occurs, if a numen influences the sort of ruptures comes in on the psyche, what I think what occurs is yeah, I was trying to find if there's a quote maybe, but anyways, can't really find anything spontaneously. But what occurs in essence is your I would formulate it this way: a complex, as it is in its connection to sort of this transcendent, this collective core, rises up and sort of releases a certain energy. This is a lot about energies, the paper, which I'm not so comfortable with in terms of the way it's talked about, but it releases energy, and that energy sort of overwhelms the psyche and gives it a certain push, a certain movement. And if that connection is maintained and deepened, you get to this moment where you have an immersion, you get to this individuation moment. And here, for that, I do have a quote. In the model, in this model that we talked about, I have something below the archetypal field, and I call this the self field. We experience the self not only as the center of the psyche, but also as the transgressive totality of the personality, which, during centroversion, right, directs the ego's development and individuation, and in large measure, faithfully guides the unified whole of the individual's life process and of his or her way of coming to terms with the world. So the whole point is that the ego has its own way. It attempts to interact with the world in a sort of hubris, which expresses in this rejection of the call to adventure, right? It expresses in this rejection to the rejection to let go of itself and delve into a sort of more de-individualized experience of what's going on. So the exploration of the complexes beyond their, the first level would be explore them based on what you could remember that would still be conscious, and the second aspect would be go deeper into what you can remember, and then go as deep as you can into what you can possibly remember, right? And that's essentially the level of the archetype, right? The level of the self. And you can't remember that. You have art as sort of a mitigator, and Neumann talks about that as well. The role of art as sort of, and active imagination for that matter, as sort of an attempted gateway into that which you can't possibly communicate, because all the self essentially then does in the end is it ruptures you, it penetrates you, and prompts you to go beyond what you already are. And I think that's quite you know, the call for adventure, right? If you look at something like Campbell's Hero Journey, the call for adventure call to adventure is essentially, it's a practice of sacrifice, essentially. And the reward, right? There's the reward, you know, whatever it may be, a treasure, a virgin, whatever it may be expressed, you know, gold. It's not really a physical reward. It's more of a because a physical reward would lead to another inflation and another sort of call to adventure. So as long as you have the physical reward that you think you bring from that depth, it's not really like there's no, you know, it's still a situation of hubris, sorry. And so it's only when you know that there is no physical reward, that what's going on is sort of strips the, you know, it fulfills the aim of stripping the ego of what it is sort of encompassed by. So Jung says, the aim of individuation is nothing less than to divest the self of the false wrappings of the persona on the one hand and the suggestive power of primordial images on the other. So, you know, same, you know, this is actually quite important for all those that are sort of engaged in, let's say, psychedelic hubris. They're taking drugs and they're like, oh my God, this is great. Like, I'm discovering the unity of the world. And that's just the identification with primordial images. That is as much hubris as the persona's imagination, who I am. Okay. I hope this helped understand relate some of these Jungian concepts to the theories that we've been talking about, especially with regards to the elements and so on. And I think now we can also from there on understand, like, how does an archetype play out in stories, right? And why do certain stories compel us? And the simple formulation would be that they compel us because they're part of us, right? In these archetypal cores, in this sort of microcosm that we inhabit, that is inhabited, that lives in us by way of its macrocosmic sort of manifestation, let's say. Okay, I hope this helps, and thank you for tuning in again. Please consider subscribing, and see you next time.